Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar on corporate power purchase agreements in the age of net zero ambitions and ESG conscientiousness, hosted by multinational law firm Pinsent Masons. I'm Shannon Derejo from Creamer Media's Contract Publishing. Today's webinar will explore how changes to energy regulations in South Africa will allow corporates to generate up to 100 megawatts of power without the need for a generation license. The regulations also allow for other relaxations in regards to wheeling of electricity that will facilitate the achievement of net zero objectives. As corporates set these net zero objectives, the external environmental, social, and governance pressures placed on corporates will play a role in how electrical power is generated and sourced. Before we begin, I'll share some general information. To encourage interaction, we've enabled the chat and the Q&A function. Please post your questions into the Q&A box, which you'll find on the panel at the bottom of your screen. Should time allow, the panelists will answer as many of your questions as possible at the end of the session. You can also interact with the panelists and other attendees in the chat box, which you'll also find at the bottom of your screen. Please be aware that we are recording this webinar and we'll send you a copy of the recording when it's available. We're also streaming the webinar live on YouTube. The speakers joining us today are Emma Dempster, Legal Director of Finance and Projects at Pinsent Masons, Alex Hoare, Vice President of Group Sustainability at Massmart, Ronan Lamb, Partner at Pinsent Masons UK office, and Chris Green, Partner for Transactional Services at Pinsent Masons. I'm going to hand over now to Chris Green to take the proceedings forward. Chris has significant experience advising on public and private M&A transactions, general corporate and commercial matters, and regulatory matters, including interactions with various government departments and other administrative organs in respect of statutory proposals and amendments. It's over to you, Chris.
Thanks, Shannon, and thanks to all of our participants for making time for this session today. We hope it's of interest to all of you. To get straight into it, South Africa, particularly the financial services sector, has historically and in recent times been acknowledged as a global leader in integrating environmental, social, and governance issues into its practices. Regulation has obviously been a key component of this. However, pressure from a variety of stakeholders, including institutional investors and asset managers, as well as public interest groups, has also and will continue to play an important role. From a regulatory perspective, the key developments over a period of time have largely been driven by requirements pertaining to institutional investors. Amongst other things, insofar as pension funds are concerned, Regulation 28 requires a fund and its board to consider any factor which may materially affect the sustainable long-term performance of an asset, including with respect to environmental, social, and governance issues in making investment decisions. Obviously, what constitutes environmental, social, and governance issues is not a closed list, and each of these categories have various considerations within themselves. The Financial Sector Conduct Authority has also published guidance on Regulation 28, which makes consideration of ESG factors central to evaluating the sustainability of any asset or investment decision. Insofar as insurers are concerned, prudential standards require an insurer's investment policy to take into account any factor that may materially affect the long-term performance of assets, including ESG factors. Other developments, more along the lines of good practice provisions rather than regulation, include the coming into effect a number of years ago of the Code for Responsible Investing in South Africa, often referred to as CRISA. This is a voluntary but influential investor-led initiative which guides investors and others on developing and implementing sustainable investment strategies. Amongst other things, Principle 1 of CRISA states that institutional investors should incorporate sustainability considerations, including ESG, into all of their investment decisions. Similarly, the King Code of Corporate Governance, of which King 4 is the most recent iteration, and which the JSE requires all publicly listed companies to apply, contains various statements relating to governance and sustainability, and in this regard, view sustainable development as a primary ethical and economic imperative, and that's a direct quote from King. Beyond formal regulation and public company imperatives, various non-profit and public benefit organizations are pursuing advocacy and shareholder activism approaches which seek to promote ESG by exerting influence and pressure on institutional investors. We've seen a steady increase in activists and stakeholders pushing for the tabling and consideration of resolutions pertaining to the disclosure of ESG-related issues at shareholder meetings, and that applies equally to private companies and public companies. That our legal framework is also constantly evolving in the same direction is clear from changes that have been made to our company law over the time and other laws. For example, the introduction of mandatory social and ethics committees for public companies and companies which meet a certain prescribed public interest score. Social and ethics committees are required to exercise oversight of and report on companies' activities in light not only of legislation, but also legal requirements and prevailing best practice. The scope of these committees covers social and economic development, corporate citizenship, the environment, health and safety, as well as relationships with consumers and labor. Bringing all of this to today's topic, we think that climate change is likely to be the key focus area from an ESG perspective for the foreseeable future, not only in South Africa, but across the continent as well. Not only will governments, regulators, investors, funders, and public interest groups continue to escalate these imperatives, but shareholder activism in the space is likely to increase significantly. Climate change considerations in the context of ESG imperatives will also go hand in hand with government and corporate commitments to strive towards a net zero environment. And it is against that backdrop that we put together today's panel discussion. From there, perhaps Emma, I can turn to you and the rest of the panel. And perhaps by way of introduction, you can outline the recent regulatory changes in the energy market in South Africa. And once you've done that, perhaps the panel can discuss whether, in their view, these changes are likely to result in an increase in the level of generation capacity contracted through corporate PPAs, and whether this will contribute positively to some of the sustainability imperatives that I've mentioned, and which corporates and institutional investors in South Africa currently face and will come under increasing pressure to address. Thanks, Emma.
Thanks, Chris. Afternoon, everyone. So I think that obviously the biggest change from an energy regulatory perspective is the one that was announced and published on the 20th of August, and interesting enough, republished on the 5th of October to correct a typing error or printing error, is the amendment to Schedule 2 of the Electricity Regulation Act. So Schedule 2 essentially is what exempts generators and other activities from having to hold a license in terms of the Electricity Regulation Act, and in certain instances they would just have to register. The main amendment that's come through, that is obviously one that's really exciting for the market, is the increase in the megawatt threshold on the generation capacity from 1 megawatt to 100 megawatt for grid connected gen facilities, both on wheeling and non-wheeling basis. So essentially, where before you were restricted to on-site generation of a 1 megawatt plant with energy being sold or distributed to one customer, now in terms of the exemption, you can have a system that's up to 100 megawatts, and the energy can be sold and consumed by multiple customers. So not only is this an increase in generation capacity, which will assist with offsite generation and not only restricted to on-site and 1 megawatts, it's the first time that the regulations are really encompassing wheeling in the context of wheeling to multiple customers. So wheeling in South Africa, it's a bit of a misnomer, is always been legally permitted. There's nothing, the regulations don't introduce wheeling as a concept. What it does do, though, is bring it into the fold of the license exemption. And why it's important from a regulatory perspective and also for corporates for achieving their net zero ambitions is removing the obligation to obtain a licensing for generation does two things. So one, it takes away the onerous licensing conditions. So it's removing one of the regulatory hurdles that was putting essentially a delay to development, because if you were going to be applying for one of these licenses, you would have had to have locked up your commercial discussions in advance, agreed your PPA, which is already could take in excess of 9 to 12 months. And only then would you be able to apply for your license, which in itself would take about 220 plus days in recent experience. And in some instances, it's actually been restrictive. Parties haven't been able to obtain a gen license. So that's really cutting down on development time and encouraging bigger generation capacity to come online. And then the other benefit is obviously you can now take advantage of wheeling. So wheeling to multiple customers. And the benefit of this is obviously positive for the market because it'll definitely assist with accelerating corporates' goals of achieving net zero, because now you can look to have portfolio-based generation. So instead of having to be restricted to 1 megawatt on-site generation, which you can now have a look at procuring energy from 100 megawatts through wheeling to multiple loads. So certainly, in my view, the change is a welcome change from a business perspective and from a markets perspective.
Thanks, Emma. And then I think just to open it up more broadly to the panel is whether or not we think that this will result in an increase in the level of generation capacity contracted through corporate PPAs and the effects for sustainability imperatives going forward. I don't know, Alex or Ronan, over to one of you.
Okay, I'll add some comment and Ronan jump in. So I think just to give you a little bit of context where we're coming from, Massmart embarked on our first solar plant back in 2016. So we've been rolling out solar plants for going on 5 years now. We now have 11 plants at our highest consuming sites, and we've just recently surpassed 18 million kilowatt hours of green energy. And this is through a combination of PPA arrangements and also on-site wholly owned plants. So we have some history and experience with this area. And also just from a corporate perspective, I mean, the points around the requirement from King and from good governance and investors are already poignant. So we are feeling more and more pressure from stakeholders and shareholders to do more from an ESG perspective. And we ourselves are deeply committed to transitioning to zero emissions. So we've set a target by 2035, we want to be using 100% renewable energy. And we understand this is a significant lift for us from where we're starting. So this is a hugely exciting topic and something that we're really committed to pursuing aggressively. I think just to give a perspective, I think that the new regulations are fantastic because they demonstrate a willingness to open this space up and to encourage corporates and other organizations to start producing more renewable energy. And by relaxing the regulations, it really does invite that. So I think overall, there's no doubt that this is really assists us in increasing the amount of renewables we bring onto the grid. I think that possibly some challenges that exist are the questions that remain unanswered around the practicalities of doing this. And it's less potentially about the size of the plants. We can now make these big plants, but how we feasibly and practically wield this power. There's a lot that we as corporates still don't understand. You know, are there going to be wheeling tariffs and what might these look like? How would we wheel across different grids? And so would we be able to put up a plant in wherever the Karoo, where there's optimal sunlight, and then utilize that power, wheel that power to somewhere in Johannesburg? And how complex would that be? So I think it's very, very exciting. The direction of travel is exactly what we wanted, where we wanted to go. But I do think there are some things that we still need to address if we're really going to be able to ramp up solar generation and make full use and benefit of wheeling capabilities.
Yeah, I think Alex, from the outside looking in, it feels like these changes, it's sort of hard to see how they won't result in an increase in corporate PPAs across South Africa. But I think you've hit the nail on the head. The devil in all of this is invariably in the detail, and it's in how do you actually facilitate the wheeling in practice. I mean, if that's been the missing piece to sort of enable offsite PPAs from projects of scale, and that's now more possible, albeit perhaps further work to be done to fully enable it, then yeah, I don't really see how this won't be the start in a journey towards more offsite PPAs in the South African market. I mean, other markets have really seen the benefits of these structures. I mean, I've been active on corporate PPAs in Europe and in Asia for the last 5 to 10 years, and those markets have really seen off-takers come in and whether it's using sleeving or wheeling or virtual structures, really found a cost-effective way of gaining certainty around electricity pricing, and sort of reducing issues around sort of short-term volatility at the same time, and then capturing that that really important, increasingly important tangible, sustainable procurement choice that that these types of structures provide, and that's something that I think we're only going to see more scrutiny around that as the years go on. I think you might be on mute, Chris.
Sorry, I thought I was off. Thanks, Ronan. I was just saying thanks very much for that. The next thing I was going to move on to was a question around items that I think you and Alex, Ronan, have already just touched on. But perhaps there's some more around that we can expand on, particularly either from a practical perspective, Alex, in your experience, or Ronan from a kind of comparative perspective, you know, internationally in other markets. But what issues do you foresee, either practical or regulatory, that will need to be addressed while corporates and investors frankly embrace this new regulatory framework and apply it in working towards sustainability imperatives? Ronan, maybe start with you. I think you and Alex have both touched on some of them, but then Alex, interested in your thoughts as well, please.
Yeah, absolutely, Chris. I mean, I think, you know, we see the large sort of energy user clients that we act for in other markets, you know, face I'd say a multitude of issues when it comes to electricity procurement, and I think, you know, corporate PPAs have a lot to offer without doubt. But I think it is worth just taking a step back, and, you know, if you're a corporate looking at this space, you know, just taking some early advice around energy strategy, I think, is always quite important. And in our view, it will pay to take advice from experienced advisors right at the outset, and whether that's on sort of energy market and strategy and pricing, to, you know, technical advisors if you're talking about on-site projects, or indeed legal advisors. But once that right advice is in place, I think it gives the corporate a real framework to work from, and it's much easier to assess, you know, what risks is the corporate prepared to take, and where its red lines are. I mean, I think the issues that we see sort of internationally, I suspect, will be certain of the issues that you know, corporates will face in the South African market. You know, creditworthiness, I think, is always you know, top of everybody's list. You know, from a generator's perspective, you're looking for a bankable PPA. You know, it's the economic underpinning of your project, so you need to you're looking to that corporate to offer you something that's, you know, very creditworthy for the duration of the PPA, and let's remember, these can be quite long-term contracts. So, you know, whether that's the corporate being required to post security, you know, parent company guarantees or letters of credit, you know, that's something that again needs to be thought about early from a corporate's perspective. But, you know, there are sort of ways to address that in the PPAs themselves. You know, you can look to undertake sort of periodic reviews of the off-taker's creditworthiness and perhaps step down the level of security if creditworthiness is generally improving. So there's lots of sort of lessons that can be learned there. You know, another issue I think is really important to think about is flexibility, and this kind of comes up in a number of perspectives. You know, we're seeing quite a big issue in Europe and other markets, around developers wanting to you know, potentially swap in and out projects from time to time, and in the horizon of the PPA you know, term, or maybe just early on in the term. And you know, the off-taker's got to consider, the corporate's got to consider, you know, how flexible do they want to be, and if they are prepared to be flexible, then you know, maybe setting out a list of, you know, really objective criteria in the PPA that dictate what is and isn't suitable. But flexibility, I think, is got a really, you know, is a really important issue from the corporate's perspective as well when it comes to power. So you know, traditionally these types of structures worked with, you know, pay as produced, off-taker taking all of the output from a particular project, and pretty limited flexibility during the term of the PPA to change what the corporate's taking. And you know, I think really important to say that, you know, each corporate PPA, I would say, is different. There is no one size fits all, and you know, lots of corporates are kind of looking increasingly to, well, how can I get a bit of flexibility into this off-take arrangement? How can I, you know, if this is a 15 or 20-year term contract, how can I, potentially turn around in year 10 and say, well, actually, I need a little bit less power here, or I need a little bit more, or I need a little bit at a different time of day, or something like that. So getting everybody kind of on board at the very start of the negotiations and understanding exactly what potential flexibility might be needed over the term of the PPA is, something I think we see as being quite important. But be good to get Alex's perspective, I think, from a South African market view.
So Ronan, I think you covered the critical points really, really well. Maybe I'll just go into a little bit of depth, and I think you can break this into two pieces. There's the technical and strategic side that the corporate needs to consider, and I think that's really important. And there's many facets to that. So one, understanding what your actual electricity requirement is accurately, understanding what you truly pay for electricity, and then understanding, to what extent those needs are going to change over time. It's really, really important before you enter into PPAs, because fundamentally for the producer of the power, they need quite a lot of certainty in order to raise capital, to build a plant to meet your needs. And so they do want something that's fairly consistent, because that's how they're basing the return. So that's an important consideration, and it's generally something that you need to spend time unpacking. And if you don't have the internal IP to do that, you need to look to get a consultant or someone who can help you navigate that. There's a lot of complexity around energy tariffs that you need to be aware of. And if you're a multi-site arrangement, that adds an additional amount of electricity complexity, because you need to know the different rates and tariffs of those different sites and their consumption and how you can connect those dots. So I think that's a critical part. And I think mostly from a corporate side, where we found challenges, it's where we haven't really understood those dimensions to begin with. And that's meant that later on, as we matured in our thinking, we found that this PPA doesn't suit us the way we would have liked it to. So I think that's a key consideration. Just think from a regulatory perspective and from a practical implementation perspective, because wheeling requires a significant investment on somebody's part to put up a plant somewhere, there is uncertainty around things like wheeling tariffs and how those are going to be handled. And that can be a bit of a stumbling block, because what it means is that the commerciality and the commercial terms of this arrangement can be hard to pin down. And there can be that can result in people feeling a sense of risk. So those are things that need to be considered, and I think those are potential challenges that, as we start to move through the space and we reach more wheeling arrangements, that's going to be pinned down, and we're going to have more clarity about how that actually works. So I think that's that's a key consideration. What I do want to say though is the huge benefit of this is currently in a South African scenario, we're essentially price takers. Eskom decides what price electricity is going to be, and we pay that price. What PPAs enable us to do is, even if it's just a portion of our consumption, it enables us to come up with an agreement where we can understand and know the price of that portion of electricity for a foreseeable time. And that's a huge advantage. So notwithstanding some of the complexity that goes into it and having to dive into the nuts and bolts of it, and the fact that there are contractual obligations, you do have a lot more say over what you want in terms of energy pricing going forwards. And also being able to predict that, which is useful, because from a cost perspective, you can then look ahead and know that whatever the portion of electricity that you're purchasing, you know what it's going to cost you next year. And that's quite helpful in terms of managing costs and managing budget. So whilst it can be complicated, we would argue that the juice is definitely worth the squeeze when it comes to doing these kinds of interventions. And then possibly, the last thing that I might want to add is that we've talked a lot about the social and environmental impact and necessity to move towards renewables, but there is real commercial opportunity, and we see both the environmental impact ramifications, and that's important, but we also see this as a commercial opportunity to lower our operating costs. And so I think perhaps there is a bit of a stigma that because it's renewable energy, you simply must be paying more for it, and that's just actually isn't the case. In 90% of the instances where we are modeling price on renewables, we are finding that we're arriving at a saving. And then it becomes really, how best to achieve that saving and what outcomes to get to. So I just also want to make that point that there is a huge commercial opportunity that's worth exploring with these and can benefit you from an operating cost perspective.
Alex, thanks. I think it's a great point. I mean, I think a lot of what we're talking about now focuses on obviously corporate striving to achieve sustainability and net zero goals and that sort of thing. But I think the commercial opportunities inherent in this are certainly not to be overlooked. So thank you for that. Ronan, you in your last comments started touching on some of this, but I wanted to ask you and Emma again whether or not you have any thoughts on how some of the issues faced by corporate off-takers can be addressed in corporate PPAs. Again, I think you started touching on it, but maybe just a topic worth building on a little bit for the participants, because obviously these will be practical issues which people will be grappling with as the regulatory framework unfolds. Can I ask you guys to just touch on that a bit, please?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, and actually just touching on something Alex mentioned, and probably, you know, as lawyers, sometimes maybe we're too risk averse in what we say about some of these structures. But, you know, we see, you know, clients who've entered into corporate PPAs in the last few years in this part of the world, where, you know, those of you are tracking energy markets in Europe, the price has just gone like that. It's gone skywards for a range of reasons, and they, you know, they baked in prices 2-3 years ago which are maybe a third of what the market prices are today, and they're still prices that give the developers of those projects enough of a return to, you know, to pay back their construction costs and return something to equity or pay their debt costs. So they're in a really strong position versus, you know, competitors in the market. So these structures can really work. Back with my sort of risk averse lawyer hat on, I guess one of the issues that we do see clients concerned about is, you know, well, what happens if I'm found to be overpaying, and I've come into this contract at a market high and the market drops tomorrow. I think what we'd always say to them is, look, these are long-term arrangements, so you've got to take quite a long-term view on power prices. And again, it goes back to the point about paying, you know, taking some time at the start, you know, to sit down with advisors and sit down with people who can give you a perspective on where the power price is likely to go in the particular market over the short, medium, and long term, so you can assess a particular price based on that. But even if you know, if there's continued nervousness, and we understand that there is within certain corporates about, you know, a long-term maybe fixed price product, you know, we are seeing you know, certain innovation around that, which can give a little bit more sort of sharing of I guess risk with respect to power price between the developer and the off-taker, such that neither party feels overly exposed to any particular market, you know, peak or trough. So, you know, we're beginning to see some hybrid fixed price and market price PPAs come forward. So it gives generator degree of certainty around part of the revenues, maybe enough to bank the project, and then there's a bit of exposure to the merchant price. And similarly gives the corporate, gives the CFOs who's signing off on this, you know, an ability to say, well, look, we're fixed at X, but there's a bit of it that's floating, and so if the market goes down, then we're able to take advantage of that to a certain respect. So you know, we're seeing some of that come into PPAs in this part of the world. You know, all the classic PPA cost protection measures, caps, collars, floors, you know, all of that can be used in corporate PPAs as well. There's you know, there's always the possibility for that. So, you know, I think that's a really interesting place to kind of follow closely. The other thing I think is worth picking up on is the sort of the ESG piece and the green publicity piece. Yes, it's probably not, and certainly until now probably hasn't been the primary driver for most corporates getting into this space. I think it's fair to say, you know, going back to Alex's point, if the economics probably drive the deal in many respects, but I think the awareness and the appreciation of sustainability, you know, in terms of purchasing choices, and in terms of even, you know, some really interesting work done around the extent to which the sustainability of an employer now influences potential future employees. You know, that's something, again, we just, you know, COP26 in a few weeks in this part of the world, you know, can't see that, you know, being anything other than more important as time goes on. And it feels like a piece that, you know, corporates some corporates are only beginning to sort of wake up to see, well, actually, hang on, I could get an economically brilliant deal here. And it comes with all of this awesome sustainability messaging, which is really genuine sustainability messaging. It's not greenwashing. It's absolutely sustainable, tangible, credible messaging that I can really go out there and differentiate myself from my competitors. So, some really great opportunities, with these types of structures, I think, for corporates.
Ronan and Emma, just sorry for jumping in. I just wanted to touch base on a couple of points that you made that I thought were really relevant. One is, in terms of PPA structuring, I think you can be very inventive in terms of doing that. And I would also just caution against immediately entering into a PPA mindset, which is, this is 15 to 20 years. It can be, but we've looked at PPAs where it's 10 years with a sort of a rent to own. And there's some advantages to that, because solar panels are, the degradation, it's a really proven technology. They work well after 20 years. Part of having them in a PPA initially is actually, to a certain extent, you have the producer do the hard yards of getting up, getting running, performing appropriately, because they're getting a revenue from it. And then after 10 years, you can go into a maintenance plan with them, and you've still got the benefit of plants, and you're getting even better savings where you haven't really had to shell out capex, and you're getting better savings that what we estimate will be probably higher electricity prices. So there's a lot of flexibility in that, and additionally, in terms of giving yourself optionality to buy the plant if you want, because we have had instances where we've PPA'd something because we had minimal appetite to spend the capex, and later on we looked at it and thought, this is a great investment actually, and we'd like to own it and have that arrangement. So in terms of the PPAs, you really can be very flexible, and it can be a win-win for both the producer and yourself. There's enough space where everyone can win. I just want to talk about the point around our employees love the fact that we put up solar plants. They love it. Our customers who park under solar panels at macro stores constantly write to us and say, we really, really like this. And to a certain extent, when we put them on the roof, people don't notice, unfortunately. But the car parks have been interesting because people see them, people comment about them, and then they get the benefit of having a shaded car park, which they didn't previously have. So really, you can't sort of overestimate the impact of that in terms of employee morale and customer feedback. One of the nicest things about solar, for example, is I love to send our CEO an image of, we've got a small solar plant at our Builders Warehouse Midrand store. It's our newest builder store. At about now, it's producing close to 90% of that store's electricity requirement. And we've obviously got a monitoring system that shows the output of solar and the consumption of the store. And I love to send him pictures of the output, because he really likes to see how the store is basically running itself on solar power. So, there are additional benefits where it certainly hasn't hurt from a performance and a commercial performance perspective, but it's really helping in terms of actually tangibly demonstrating that we can make a transition and we can get away from fossil fuels, which is a really good thing for the environment. So just really, really, really nice sort of basket of goods that renewables provides. And then probably my last point, just hopping back to the PPAs, one huge advantage of a PPA, and particularly solar, is that solar energy, the sun does not have an inflationary increase every year. It doesn't pass an inflationary increase, which means, and the maintenance costs of the solar plants are actually pretty minimal, which means that you can structure deals where you have very low escalations. All I make the point that the lawyers will have many views on this, but one of the things that I think is a great advantage is you can have very knowable increases. And so you don't necessarily need to tie your increases into grid-related increases or a percentage thereof. You can look at this and come up with platforms where you can monitor electricity consumption over time, and you can have very low escalations. And that can be quite nice if you are risk averse, because you've really controlled that aspect of your cost. So that's a couple of additional thoughts.
Ronan, Alex, thanks. Emma, I just wondered if you had any additional comments there to build on what Ronan and Alex have said.
No, I was going to say that's exactly right. I mean, to Ronan's point earlier, like no PPAs are the same, because you've got to have a look at the commercial drivers of the client. So what is the corporate's main commercial drivers, and how risk adverse or willing to de-risk the project and share in the risk, because that'll obviously impact also the price certainty or the price costing that you're looking for in the PPA, or from a commercial perspective. You can achieve that through the sharing of risk in the PPA itself, if you know, as the corporate, you're willing to take that kind of approach on, you know, understanding what are the market drivers, what are the regulatory challenges, what does the developer need to achieve from their perspective in order to ensure that they have, you know, investor certainty on their side, and how do you match the two needs. So we're seeing that where, you know, 5 years ago, maybe there was far more of an emphasis on looking for, you know, a cost driver, cheaper power, a bit more price certainty there, and certainly corporates being more risk adverse, because it was a new market on the C&I space, you know, 10 to 5 sort of years ago. We're moving, what we're seeing, certainly on the legal perspective, is a move towards far more risk sharing between customer and client, as to, you know, instead of forcing penalties onto, so delays, for an example, is something that you can actually look to work with the developer from a corporate perspective rather than imposing penalties. You know, Alice touched on a few of their other regulatory issues that come into play on grid connection challenges. How do you overcome, if you're looking at it from a wheeling perspective, you're now looking at a completely different sort of mechanism on how do you share with the risk there, around the different jurisdictions that you're looking to wheel across, and the multiple contracts that you're going to have to conclude. So the sort of takeaway that we're looking at when we're dealing with the PPAs now is how best to de-risk the project for both parties. So instead of only looking at the PPA as a service, you're just buying power, is how can you look at it as an investment, a long-term investment together with the developer that you've chosen. And then there's more of a willingness on the corporate side to share in some of the risks. And the developers will often, you know, come to the party themselves. If they're getting sufficient returns, they can assume some of the risks that corporates are not. So there's many ways to structure the PPA from that perspective, as to whether it's on-site generation, off-site. Are you looking to, you know, purchase the solar plant at any point during the term, or is that not part of your business model? You would rather it was just a pure PPA, and you can deal with a lot of those issues through the contract itself.
Emma, thanks. I think you've made some interesting points there around risk sharing and the approach to it, particularly in the context of the new regulatory regime. And it brings me to a question that I wanted to ask around, you know, and it's a question to the panel, not any of you particularly, but whether or not you think that there's likely to be appetite amongst generators to take volume risk, and whether corporates would be willing to pay a premium for generators to do this. And again, Emma, maybe I should start with you, because I think it speaks closely to some of the points that you were just making in your last comments.
Sure. So my view is yes. Generators are taking more volume risk, and they're more willing to put out yield guarantees. Obviously, there's this sort of expectation that the off-taker will give a return commitment on a level of consumption. And there's ways to manage that risk from the generator's perspective. And it goes to Ronan's point about, you know, accurate demand forecasting and load profiling. So you're not oversizing the system, you understand the consumption risk and the load profile of the customer. So when you set your volume guarantees, you can manage that risk from a generator perspective. And we're also seeing, obviously, from the corporate side, more of an expectation that there will be a yield guarantee or, you know, volume risk taken by the generator, particularly in the context of meeting ESG requirements. Because if you're pushing down and you have to have your green energy or your renewables targets, you need some sort of certainty that the partner that you're partnering with and procuring the power farm will deliver.
Ronan, Alex, any additional thoughts on that?
Just to echo, I think what Emma's saying, you know, from an international perspective, I think we've only seen one direction of travel on this, and it's towards generators being prepared to take more volume risk. I think if there is a premium payable, and I think, you know, sometimes there is, generators will find a way to extract that if they possibly can, and, you know, that can be done from, you know, quite a simple way in terms of, you know, sizing that volume guarantee appropriately so that you feel confident you're always going to be able to deliver it, you know, at its most simple, right up to, you know, adding sort of financial hedging derivative type products on the generator side, so that it can back off certain risks, maybe weather risk, things like that, so that it again feels more confident to be able to come to the off-taker and say, well, look, we'll be prepared to take a degree of volume risk on this. So yes, definitely something that we're seeing more of. Yeah, as I said, I think if there's additional value to the corporate in having certainty around volume, which I think there probably is, generators will find a way to extract that and provide it if they possibly can.
I think that's a perfect summary of the situation. I think that from a corporate perspective, one, in terms of setting targets, we do want to guarantee certain levels of production. And then two, often when we're purchasing solar energy, we're purchasing it at a better price than we can get it from grid. And so there's a commercial implication if we get less than we contracted to get. And so, we want to see that, we would like to guarantee that. But I also think there's an acknowledgement that most of their outputs are forecasted. And so, just because we've forecasted 700,000 kilowatt hours of renewable energy produced every year, we're generally quite happy to accept, a 10% margin for error, given weather and other things. So I think it's more a question of reasonability than it is about, you said 700,001 and we only got 699,000 and we're now really upset. It's just ballpark, levels of production and performance. So I think that's pretty consistent. I also think as we get more experience in the local market, the installers and generators understand the outputs better. So there's model outputs, but there's also experience in terms of sites and what the panels will actually deliver. And what we're seeing is that performance gaps are generally much smaller and forecasting accuracy is better.
Thanks, everyone. I think to step briefly away from the specifics of the corporate PPAs and just to talk about potentially broader supply chain and value chain, I think what we see is that some corporates have gone further than just entering into corporate PPAs and are now looking at what they themselves can do to increase the use of corporate PPAs amongst other large energy users. Do we consider that corporates have a responsibility to help encourage others along the way with respect to corporate PPAs? And if so, what steps do we see these corporates taking to achieve this, either currently or in the future? Alex, maybe I can start with you on that one.
Yeah, perfect. So, as a retailer, there's an expectation that we take a lot of responsibility for our suppliers, and that's both reasonable in terms of the decisions we make when we source, and the fact that we're prepared to list their products and put them on our shelves and be their agents effectively. So, we appreciate that we need to take responsibility for our suppliers to a certain extent, but we've also got to contrast that against the fact that we don't own these businesses. In many instances, they can be large enough that if we don't procure from them, they'll just sell to someone else, one of our competitors, and I will lose the sale from a customer perspective. So there's a balance point there that is that we need to work within. Our take on this at the moment is really around focusing on advocating for the benefits of this. And so our approach has largely been, historically, retailers, I think, have potentially been guilty of saying, what, we need more renewable energy. We're going to make a commitment on behalf of our supply chain, and our suppliers will go up and do that because what they want our business. We very deliberately said, one of the best ways we can present the case is by modeling this behavior in our business and building credibility. And so our primary focus has been developing the business case within our business. So we can go back to suppliers and credibly say to them, hi guys, we've been doing renewables. We really believe it works. You can see if you visit these sites, this is what we've done and this is what we've learned. So, and I think that's an important piece because otherwise you can't demonstrate and be credible when you engage and advocate with suppliers. So that's the first part. I think that the point we've now moved on to is around advocacy. So we do a couple of things. One is we send out a supplier advocacy, environmental advocacy survey to all of our suppliers. And we ask them to give us information about what they're doing from an energy efficiency perspective, what they're doing with packaging, what progress they're making around renewables. We score their feedback, and then we actually send back the suppliers scored feedback, comparing their performance with that of their peers. And the idea here is to try and get a sense of a bit of peer pressure and normative dampening to say, this is how you perform, but you're actually quite below your peer set. And then we give some advice around areas that they could focus on and potentially pull out energy efficiency and renewable energy. So that's part of the program. The feedback we consistently got from suppliers, though, was particularly the top performing suppliers is, we do a lot in this space. We are never recognized. We don't see any advantage to it. So we're going to continue to do it, but we really appreciate if someone took the time to recognize our efforts. And so to do that, we now recognize top performing suppliers, and we place particular emphasis on suppliers that are doing things from renewable energy. So we do an evaluation, we do a site visit, we actually assess their publicly available information, and we host a supplier environmental awards where we call out those suppliers who've been exceptional from an environmental perspective. So the idea here is to just highlight to the market that suppliers are doing good work, and one of the critical factors we focus on is renewables. I do think that as we start to progress and as we land renewables in our business more, we're going to become more invested in finding ways to support our suppliers to transition to renewables, albeit that supply bases are massive and very complex. And so part of it is working with suppliers to understand the IP that goes into it so that they can do this for themselves, rather than mandating conditions to suppliers which might result in cost or just disrupt their businesses.
I think that's a really interesting perspective, Alex, and I think we've seen both sides of the coin. You and Massmart clearly taking the advocacy approach and the sort of the carrot approach of kind of assisting the supply chain with understanding these structures and the potential benefits of them. And certainly we have a number of clients in Europe who are doing exactly the same thing, and it's paying real dividends, I'd say. What we have seen in other markets, though, is the sort of stick approach, and it has definitely yielded results in the sense of supply chain having to come to the table with renewable propositions and having to find them pretty quickly. And there've been markets like Taiwan is a really good example where you've had some huge corporate PPAs in the offshore wind space, all of which are, or a number of which are driven by the supply chain for the likes of Apple, where Apple turned around and said, right, basically everybody, we have our own, 100% renewable target by 2025 or whatever it is, and we expect the supply chain to just, follow suit. And that must have been difficult for the supply chain in Taiwan, but they've found ways of getting there through corporate PPAs. So, yeah, seeing both approaches, but I must admit I'm certainly drawn more to the advocacy approach. I think that's likely to yield better results in the long term.
Yeah, thanks, Alex, Ronan. Emma, anything to add before I move on to the next point?
No, nothing from my side, Chris. I think Alex and Ronan have covered that off nicely.
Thanks. I think not unrelated to what we've just been discussing, but is a question around how, and this is potentially a question for advisors and larger corporates, but how can we enable smaller corporates to enter the corporate PPA market? And again, what impediments, practical or regulatory? And again, I think, Ronan, you touched on this earlier, might there be for less creditworthy corporates to come into this space? Is there potential for aggregated deals to be the solution? And again, Ronan, maybe start with you, and then you can hand over to Alex and Emma.
Yeah, no, happy to come in on that. I think, with the risk of repeating myself, I think that advocacy and education piece is going to be really critical to enabling, the sort of the next tier of corporates to come to the table. So, explaining how these structures work, introducing them to the right advisors, showing them how the projects work and how they're structured. All of that's really key, and there's probably lots of different stakeholders in the market that can help with that. So people who've been on the journey already, like Alex, industry bodies, some of the large corporates who've done corporate PPAs in one market and then can bring them to another, that all have roles in that. But yes, when you're kind of looking at the kind of say the next tier down, not your sort of multinationals, how can they access this market? And there are challenges, without question. Some of these structures can feel a little complex, and in particular if you don't have someone whose day-to-day job is just energy, for example, they might have lots of hats and within a business, and it can be more difficult for those types of businesses to take advantage. Specifically on the creditworthiness piece, I would say there are ways of kind of enhancing the creditworthiness of a business for the purposes of these types of structures. We have seen aggregated structures in other markets. There was a really interesting corporate PPA done in the UK where 20 universities came together to strike a deal. None of those universities on their own would have been sufficiently creditworthy to have got a deal over the line, but actually the kind of aggregated buying power of them was deemed sufficient. And we've also seen structures where, maybe a more creditworthy off-taker takes a big slug of the power from a particular project, and a less creditworthy off-taker comes in alongside, so that the lack of creditworthiness is less of an issue. That can work. Or you kind of sort of, depending on the regulatory treatment, you kind of resale arrangements where maybe large creditworthy corporate fronts the deal and someone kind of comes in behind and sort of buys from them. So there are definitely ways of kind of enhancing the creditworthiness or putting structures in place to facilitate it. But I think the key in the first instance is to explain how these structures work, get that understanding kind of known across the market, advocate for the benefits of these structures, show corporates that might think, oh, this is too difficult, that actually it's not that difficult. There's huge tangible economic advantages to doing it, plus all of the ESG boxes that this ticks, and the engagement you're going to get from your investors and from your customers and from your employees alike. So big advocacy piece, I think.
So I think, just to add to that, the small corporates, I think, is tricky because the business needs are variable. And so unpacking that, and I think for procurement like this, for PPAs, it is often a volume play. That's what makes it work. And so aggregating small volume is tricky because you have small businesses using power at differential times across multiple different municipalities or spaces, and to try and collectively aggregate that is tricky. I think that to Ronan's point, the most important first step is really bringing on large-scale wheeling arrangements where we're starting to make this work. We're bringing on renewables through wheeling arrangements, where that paves the way for looking at more flexible structures and sort of free floats, where we're purchasing 95% of the power from a large site somewhere, and there's 5% remainder that we can allocate to small purchases. They don't in themselves have the volume, but they can trade off our volumes. The first step, though, is getting those large volumes onto the grid and being wheeled effectively by the bigger players. I think that's what's required in this space. In terms of the smaller corporates, I think there's another piece where you've also got to stratify those groups, because you have sort of almost single sole proprietors who have very small sites and potentially would benefit from a modular solar plant that they capitalize themselves and just offset some of their consumption. And that's, I think that's that has a place that has a role to play. And they need the IP to understand where they're positioned and how that could benefit them. And potentially then it's more about loans and soft loans and payback systems to pay back those systems that they eventually own. Then there's a group that falls below the bigger sort of players who use sizable amounts of electricity, who could benefit from purchased energy at better prices. And I think that's the group that will benefit from more large-scale wheeling initiatives coming in place. And then sort of the structures that Ronan's mentioning around saying, well, we're bringing this much on board. We've got generators who someone's dropped off from a capacity perspective, we've got excess capacity, or we're overproducing based on what we expected. How do we then facilitate markets or vehicles around which those smaller players can start to buy into the space? And one of the things that I would want to see is, because the bulk arrangement is already agreed, those players can play much more flexibly. So, for us, if we're setting up a site and the macro is going to be there for 20 years, it's not a big deal. We're taking a big punt on 20 years anyway. It's not a big deal to sign a 20-year PPA. If you're a very small player, you possibly don't want to sign yourself up for a contract of that duration. So be able to play in a 5-year space where you're buying excess power, and that's really exciting. But you need those big volumes to come on board before that can happen. So for us, I think it's IP education, normalizing this as a very feasible, viable option for businesses, and then paving the way to make more volume available on the grid, so that people can start to feed on that.
I mean, from a on the grounds approach, that's exactly what we're seeing happening at the moment now. So to take us back to where the regulations are now opening it up, is where before you could have wheeling single customer, one one generator, one customer. Now with the change in the regulations, and you no longer trigger those license requirements, we're starting to have a look at, and there's a couple of projects that are having a look at that now, is you can now secure your blue chip off-taker, who doesn't necessarily require 100% of the generation capacity from your plant, and the bulk of that will go to your creditworthy off-taker. And then there's an exploring of now you can wheel the excess to your your smaller corporate or additional corporate. Obviously, that comes with its own challenges from the regulatory perspective on wheeling, and then what level of certainty from the generator's perspective you actually require, depending on how much that excess is versus the bulk. But certainly that's what we're starting to see happen now, to try for generators to bring online bigger facilities to take advantage of this 100 megawatt license lift. And even before that, they were having a look at it with the license, with going through the process of getting the license. So that's certainly something that is happening. And then I would support Alice's view there on, if you're smaller P2I LTD, you would be looking for on-site generation and not necessarily to take advantage of wheeling and the risks that would be associated with it at this point in the regulatory framework. Hopefully at some point in the future, but for now, you would look to do something small scale on that perspective.
Thanks, everyone. Just conscious of time, I think we're rapidly getting to the end of our allotted time. We've covered our agenda. Unless Ronan, Emma, Alex, anything that you guys would like to say in closing, there are a couple of questions in the Q&A. Maybe I can just check if there's anything you'd like to add. Otherwise, we can maybe just address those quickly. All good? There's a question from Daniel Lloyd. He asked earlier whether there are any JSE listed companies positioned for growth in renewable energies following government's decision to allow IPPs up to 100 megawatts. The one that sprang to mind for me, which I shot to Daniel in a message, is Hulisani. I'm sure there are others that others can think of. Daniel's come back and said he sees that Montauk Renewables listed earlier this well, and he asks, given global commitments to drive net zero emissions, I guess investing early, in renewable companies is a way in which individuals can drive change. I think just from my perspective, and I think from a corporate perspective, and then interested in the thoughts of others, Daniel, yes, absolutely. I think early stage investing in entities of that is certainly a way in which individuals can drive change. But I think there's obviously and it goes to the kind of intro that I spoke to at the beginning of the session. There's obviously a second, potentially less direct way, which is making sure that when investing, the investments are targeted towards entities who have given clear and measurable commitments to ESG imperatives, clear and measurable commitments to achieving a net zero. And I think that these things, they certainly are in some respects on the JSE. The JSE has already established a separate index or an index where commitments to sustainability imperatives is measured. And I think that the measurability of these things is going to increase over time, making it easier and more accessible to individuals and others to make investment decisions around corporates, which will drive these imperatives in the right direction. So that's just from my perspective, but I'm not sure, Ronan, Emma, or Alex, whether you wanted to add to that.
Chris, I just wanted to add to the point. I think the point that you make around looking at companies that are transitioning to renewables in the way that they do business, and then incentivizing them to do so, or supporting that change by investing in them is a really, really good thing to do. And just to your point around the JSE, I mean, the JSE have got an index called FTSE for Good, which aligns to the New York Stock Exchange's index, where we provide information related to our performance on almost 300 different indicators. I saw an interesting graph the other day of the FTSE for Good leadership index as compared with the other JSE listed indices. And typically the leadership index, the FTSE for Good leadership index performed better than competitors. So, quite a nice reference around companies that are doing things around good corporate governance and driving these initiatives tend to perform better over time. And so, I just would echo that in whatever space that you happen to be investing in.
Yeah, Alex, thank you. The name of the index escaped me, so thank you for that. There's another question there, Emma, and maybe this is one for you, just to put you on the spot. But Estienne de Toy asks, is the 100 megawatt limit based on nameplate installed capacity, or is it based on contracted capacity?
Sure. So it's based on output power. So in the regs, they define capacity for the purposes of the license exemption based on the output power of the facility.
Great, thank you. We've gone 4 o'clock, Shannon, so I think from our side, there are no further questions that I can see. So maybe I can hand back to you at that point.
Great, thanks very much, Chris. As Chris mentioned, we've now run out of time, unfortunately. I think we did get through all our Q&A, so thanks very much to everyone who participated. If you would still like to be in touch with us, you obviously can. But so far, that brings us to the end of our webinar. I would like to take this opportunity to say thank you to our panelists, Emma Dempster, Alex Hoare, Ronan Lamb, and facilitator Chris Green. Thank you also to the attendees for taking the time to join us to hear more about corporate purchase power agreements in the age of net zero ambitions. If you'd like more information on the legal aspects of such agreements, please be sure to visit Pinsent Masons' website at www.pinsentmasons.com. The recording of today's webinar will be sent to you in due course, and if you have any additional questions, please do be in touch. You can reach us at shannon@creamermedia.co.za. Thank you very much. Stay safe, everyone. Stay well, and goodbye.